Hello again, here we are with the first member of the D family, DAP, delivered at place. Delivered ready to be unloaded at the named destination. In D group, the responsibility of any damage to the products, to the merchandise, is on the seller until the delivery point, which is always a point in the country of destination. Disclaimer: I'm not a lawyer and lessons given are not legal advice. I'm just sharing my professional knowledge and experiences earned over 2 decades. The quotes we use from the Incoterms 2020 book are all the intellectual property of ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, whom I thank for their effort and perseverance in updating and revising the terms and also permitting us to use the quotes. Here we are with the diagram of DAP. As you see here, we have the 3 lines of risk transfer, freight charge, and insurance. The risk transfer, as you can see, is showing that the responsibility of any damage to the products, to the merchandise, is on the seller until the delivery point, which is in the country of destination, on the truck, ready to be unloaded. Freight charge is also the same, and the seller pays the freight charge until the delivery point. Insurance line is white, meaning that the insurance is logically bought by the seller in order to cover its risk up to the delivery point. As you can see, this term can be used with all means of transport, but in case of a combined transport, some problems may emerge, which is not advised. DAP requires the seller to deliver to a place named by a buyer, typically the buyer's premises. The buyer is responsible for unloading the means of transport. The seller has to carry out any export formalities and the buyer has to carry out any import formalities. Like with CPT and CIP, the seller contracts for carriage and risk transfers only upon delivery, which now is at the buyer's premises. The seller has no obligation to the buyer to insure for its risk. This rule works well for transport of goods by land within the Europe or Central Asia landmass, but strikes potential problems once there is a change in mode of transport along the way. A1. General obligations. In each of the 11 rules, the seller must provide the goods and their commercial invoice as required by the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity such as an analysis certificate or weighbridge document, etc., that might be relevant and specified in the contract. Each of the rules also provides that any document can be in paper or electronic form as agreed to in the contract, or if the contract makes no mention of this, then as is customary. The rules do not define what electronic form is. It can be anything from a PDF file to blockchain or some format yet to be developed in the future. B1. General obligations. In each of the rules, the buyer must pay the price for the goods as stated in the contract of sale. The rules do not refer to when the payment is to be made, before shipment, immediately after shipment, 30 days after shipment, half an hour and a half later, or whatever, or how it is to be paid. Prepayment against an email of copy documents, on presentation of documents to a bank under a letter of credit, or other arrangements. These matters should be specified in the contract. A2. Delivery. The DAP and DDP rules require the seller to take on almost the maximum responsibility of placing the goods at the disposal of the buyer at the agreed destination place or point within the place, but not unloaded from the arriving means of transport. This usually would be a truck, but could be a train, a barge, even a ship, and unlikely though, it might be a chartered aircraft. The DPU rule goes one step further, requiring the seller to unload the goods from the arriving means of transport. DPU is the old DA2 rule, but expanded to mean any place to avoid the misunderstanding of the 2010 rule, where many took it literally from its title to just mean a terminal, even though it meant anywhere from an open field to a covered warehouse, including the buyer's warehouse. Here we mention DAP, DDP, DPU, and DAT. In DAP, as we are discussing now, the merchandise will be delivered on truck, ready to be unloaded. and the custom affairs in the country of destination is on the buyer. DDP, meaning delivery duty paid, requires the seller to do the customs affair in the country of destination. DPU is the same as DAP, but with one difference, and that is the unloading in the delivery point. In DPU, the merchandise must be unloaded and the unloading is on the seller. A common mistake with DAP and DDP especially is the reverse of the misunderstanding with the old DAT, to believe that the destination will always be the buyer's premises, but this need not be the case. The buyer could nominate, say, the site of a new factory they are building for their client. It could be the container terminal in the destination country or somewhere else. If it is the buyer's premises or a site they have nominated, then usually they would have the equipment on hand to unload the goods, but sometimes the truck will have a crane mounted on it or even a forklift trucked into the rear of it. Or the goods are so specialized that the seller would need to also provide the equipment to unload the goods, making it DPU. If the destination is a terminal, then it would be usual that the seller's carrier would unload the means of transport to arrange for that unloading, such as the container from the truck delivering it from the quay, the goods from the chartered aircraft, and so on, again making it DPU and not DAP. The delivery must be made on the agreed date or within the agreed period. B2 delivery. The buyer's obligation is to take delivery when the goods have been delivered as described in A2. A3. Transfer of risk. In all the rules, the seller bears all risks of loss or damage to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2 described above. The exception is loss or damage in circumstances described in B3 below, which varies depending on the buyer's role in B2. B3. Transfer of risk. The buyer bears all risk of loss or damage to the goods once the seller has delivered them as described in A2. If the buyer fails to inform the seller exactly to where it is to deliver the goods, or if the buyer fails to import clear the goods, then it bears the risk of loss or damage to the goods from the agreed date or agreed period of delivery. For example, if the seller dispatches the goods to the buyer and they are held indefinitely by the importing country's authorities because the buyer failed to obtain the necessary import permit, then the buyer bears the risk. There are 2 points to mention here. First, about the delivery. As stated in DAP, the delivery happens when the truck is ready to be unloaded at the place nominated by the buyer. So if for any reason the buyer fails to unload the truck, then whatever happens to the merchandise during that period of waiting is on the buyer. Also, as we said before, the custom affairs in the country of destination is on the buyer. So if because of any reason or any lack of documents or permits or any kind of authorizations, the merchandise is kept in the customs house because the buyer fails to do that, then all the risks of damage or any cost emerging from this failure will be on the buyer. A4. Carriage. The seller must arrange or contract for carriage to the named place of destination, and if there is an agreed point within that destination, then to that point. Cost of this carriage is for the seller. As the seller has to arrange the carriage, it needs to know from the buyer if there is a specific point in the place of delivery to which the goods must be transported. For example, if the destination is shown as simply as Budapest, Hungary, where in that large metropolis is the seller's carrier to leave the goods? It could be that it is to be the buyer's premises or a particular location, say in an empty building site, or the carrier's premises, or the airport, or the container yard, or a particular quay on the river. The exact point should be agreed upon. If it is not, then it is the seller's choice to select the point that best suits its purpose, usually being the cheapest option such as a cargo terminal. For DAP and DDP, if the delivery of the destination is to occur after the buyer completes any necessary import formalities, then the cost of storage due to delays in those formalities being completed is for the buyer, always assuming the seller has provided the buyer with necessary documents in time. For DDP, it is the seller who bears the cost of any storage due to delays in import clearance. B4, carriage. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to arrange a contract of carriage. As you might know, the customs clearance may require special documents and approvals from the country of origin or the country of destination, such as import permits. So in this scenario, we have two parties responsible for these documents. In order to avoid any problem or any delay in customs affairs, the buyer and the seller must arrange all documents needed, either for the export in the country of origin or for the import formalities in the country of destination, so that it can run smoothly. A5, insurance. Despite the seller having the risk of loss or damage to the goods up to the delivery point, the seller does not have an obligation to the buyer to insure the goods. B5, insurance. Because the seller has the risk of loss or damage to the goods up to the delivery point, the buyer does not have an obligation to the seller to insure the goods. As you can see in DAP, the insurance up to the delivery point is on the seller. So in case the buyer has to transport the merchandise from the delivery point to another place, a wise buyer would buy sufficient insurance to cover any kind of damage to the goods from the point of delivery to the final destination. A6, delivery transport document. The seller, at its own cost, must provide the buyer with any document the buyer needs to take over the goods. What form this document takes will depend on agreement in the contract and might simply be in the form of a receipt which the buyer is to sign. However, it might, in the case of DAP and DPU, where the buyer must import clear the goods, be a copy of the seller transport document to evidence the export and the date of shipment. B6, delivery transport document. The buyer must accept the document provided in A6 as it actually takes no part in the transport process. Well, accepting the delivery and accepting the transport document means that you confirm the conformity of the products that you have received with the products that you have stipulated in the contract. So when we say the buyer must accept the document provided in A6, it means that you have to check your products at the delivery point, hiring an inspection company or a third party to check the goods for you. Usually, in case of a DAP, the products are checked as for the quality in the country of origin in order not to waste any time and cause any delays at the delivery point. A7, export-import clearance. Where applicable, the seller must at its own risk and expense carry out all export clearance formalities required by the country of export, such as licenses or permits, security clearance for export, pre-shipment inspection, and any other authorizations and approvals. Additionally, as the point of delivery in these rules is in the important country, the seller must also carry out and pay for any formalities required by any country of transit before that delivery occurs. The seller has no obligation to arrange any import clearances. However, if the buyer requests at its own risk and cost, the seller must assist in obtaining any documents and/or information which relate to formalities required by the country of import, such as permits or licenses, security clearance for import, pre-shipment inspection required by the import authorities, and any other official authorizations or approvals. Keeping in mind that any custom clearance or any formalities or any official authorizations in the countries of transit is on the seller, definitely a wise seller would check all the needed documents for such processes, because in case of any delay emerging from such problems will be on the seller. As you might know, the delivery time which is stipulated in the contract is quite clear And in case of any delay because of formalities in the countries of transit, which is on the seller, it can be the breach of the contract, and it can give enough excuse to the buyer to cancel the contract and walk away from the deal. B7. Export-import clearance. Where applicable, the buyer must assist the seller at the seller's request, risk and cost, in obtaining any documents and/or information needed for all export-related formalities required by the country of export, as well as any formalities required by any country of transit. Where applicable, the buyer must carry out and pay for all formalities required by the country of import. These include licenses and permits required for import, import clearance, security clearance for transit and import, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorizations and approvals. A8. Checking, packaging, marking. In all rules, the seller must pay the costs of any checking operations which are necessary for delivering the goods, such as checking quality, measuring the goods and/or packaging, weighing, counting the goods and/or packaging. The seller must also package the goods at its own cost, unless it is usual for the trade of the goods that they are sold unpackaged, such as in the case of bulk goods. The seller must also take into account the transport of the goods and package them appropriately, unless the parties have agreed in the contract that the goods be packaged and/or marked in a specific manner. B8. Checking, packaging, marking. In all rules, there is no obligation from the buyer to the seller as regards packaging and marking. These can in practice, however, be agreed exceptions, such as when the buyer provides the seller with labels, logos, or similar. As we said before, if the buyer fails to provide labels, logos, or similar things they are supposed to give to the seller in order to complete the packaging, any delays and any costs emerging from these delays and any damage to the goods in this period of delay will be on the buyer. A9. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay all costs until the goods have been delivered under A2, other than any costs the buyer must pay as stated in B9. Transport costs resulting from the contract of carriage, including costs of loading the goods and any transport-related security, must be paid by the seller. The cost of providing to the buyer proof of the goods being delivered are also for the seller. If the contract of carriage includes unloading at the agreed destination, the seller must pay these. As we said before, in this case the term will be DPU and not DAP. The seller must pay any costs involved in providing the usual proof that the goods have been delivered. The seller pays any costs, export duties and taxes, where applicable, related to export clearance and any transit clearance. If the buyer is requested by the seller to provide information or documents to assist the seller in their export formalities or arranging insurance, then the seller must pay the buyer for these costs. Keeping in mind that all transit formalities are on the seller must take care of any requirements for transit in the countries of transit, because as you know, when the delivery date is stipulated in the contract, if any delay happens in this process and the delivery is postponed because of these delays, it can be regarded as a breach of contract and the buyer can find enough excuse to walk away from the deal and leave you with all expenses you will suffer. B9. Allocation of costs. The buyer pays the seller all costs relating to the goods from when they have been delivered, other than those payable by the seller. If the seller has been requested by the buyer to provide assistance in obtaining information or documents needed for the buyer to effect import formalities, then the buyer must reimburse the seller's costs. Where applicable, the buyer pays any duties, taxes, and other costs for import clearance. The buyer pays for unloading costs unless they were paid by the seller under the contract of carriage. Additionally, and provided the seller has advised that the goods have been clearly identified as the goods under the contract, the buyer pays any additional costs incurred if the buyer fails to give notice in accordance with B10. A10 Notices. The seller must give the buyer any notice the buyer needs to receive the goods. B10 Notices. If the parties agree in the contract, the buyer must give the seller sufficient notice of when and the point within the place of destination where they require delivery. The contract will usually detail how much notice is to be given, and this might vary with the mode or modes of transport. Points to keep in mind. 1. After the merchandise is delivered, arrived at the nominated place and ready for unloading, all costs are on the buyer. In case of DAP destination CY, container yard, there have been contentious cases as for the THC costs and etc. 2. In DAP, the import formalities is on the buyer, so in case the delivery is agreed to be DAP buyer premises, the delivery time may be violated due to problems in customs clearance, which is beyond the seller's control. That's why it is not interviewing to sellers. 3. Just like CPT, CIP, CFR, and CIF, if the buyer fails to collect the container or walk away from the deal for any reason, then the carrier will charge the seller for all storage, demurrage, THC, etc. So the seller must buy contingency insurance in order not to run into such problems. 4. As you may know, the carrier allows few days after unloading from the vessel, free time, to the seller who has contracted them to strip the container and send the empty container back to the carrier's CY. So the customs clearance time and unloading time must be clearly defined in the sales contract. 5. According to the nature of the term, the delivery point may harshly vary according to the seller's or buyer's guidelines. So the scenarios change when the delivery point changes. The most complicated scenario is DAP buyer's premises. A. The container is carried to the destination port, cost seller, risk seller. B. The unloading is done by the port operator, cost seller, risk seller. C. The container is moved to the CY by the terminal operator, cost seller, risk seller. D. The customs clearance process starts, cost buyer, risk buyer. E. The goods are shipped from the customs to the buyer's premises, cost seller, risk seller. F. The container is unloaded at the buyer's premises, cost buyer, risk buyer. G. The container is reloaded and sent to the carrier CY, cost seller, risk seller. 6. If the term is DAP port of destination, then the delivery will happen while the container is on the vessel and the unloading cost is on the buyer. A. The container is carried to the destination port, cost seller, risk seller. B. The unloading is done by the port operator, cost buyer, risk buyer. The cost of unloading is collected from the buyer as a part of THC, terminal handling charges. If, according to the contract between the shipper and the carrier, the unloading cost is included to avoid complication, then the DPU destination port will be the correct option. This is also true for DAP destination airport, which is better BDPU destination airport. 7. The truck detention fees can be a problem in this term. If the buyer fails to unload the goods from the truck, then the delay fee must be reimbursed to the seller, as it is the one who contracted the local shipping company from the customs until the buyer's premises. 8. The buyer needs an original copy of the bill of lading and other shipping documents to release the goods from the customs. If the shipment arrives before the shipping documents, especially in case of an LC, then the buyer fails to fulfill the agreed time for customs clearance. So the buyer mustn't take over the delivery of the shipping documents, and the seller must find the best way to send the documents to the buyer or the buyer's advising bank. I faced such a problem when I received a shipment of corn from Russia. 9. In fact, in all terms except Ex Works, the seller is to deliver the shipping documents to the buyer. So any delay or mistake caused by the seller which causes the buyer lose time and money will be the seller's liability. So the sales contract must include such item and clarify the consequences the seller will face in such a case. 10. In the book Incoterms 2020, it is mentioned in the cost allocation section that the unloading costs at the destination is on the seller in case the unloading is included in the carriage contract. This is a problem since in such a case the term will be DPU and not DAP. 11. In the articles we saw about the notices during the slides, the book has made it clear that giving on-time notices are of a high importance, so the seller and the buyer must send official notices to each other as for each step of the merchandise movement. 12. It is true that the export and import formalities are seller and buyer's responsibilities in this term, but in either both processes, if one party needs necessary information or documents from the other side to fulfill the task, they must provide them immediately in order to avoid any delay and inconveniences. 13. This term is a bad choice for a letter of credit. Of course, when we talk about a bad choice, we mean for the seller, because the seller will not receive any payment until the delivery is done, and in case the buyer wants to walk away from the deal, there will be some difficulties. 14. The Incoterms rules skip when the title passes from seller to buyer. This needs to be defined separately in the sales contract.